I'd just like to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsor, PensionBee, the UK's leading online pension provider. PensionBee can help you transfer most old pensions together into one new online plan, so you'll know exactly how much you've saved and where to find it. If you are looking for a low-cost, hassle-free way to consolidate your pension pots, excluding final salary pensions, then PensionBee is worth considering. When you transfer your pensions, you can pick from a range of purpose-built pension plans, and if you want to contribute more to your pension, you can do that too. A combination of investment fund performance, low costs and excellent customer service have clearly been integral in PensionBee gaining over 265,000 customers, over £6 billion in assets and an excellent rating on Trustpilot. You can sign up in minutes with the names of old employers or providers. As always with investments, your capital is at risk.
Hello and welcome to episode 497 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, how are you doing?
I'm excited, Andy, for a couple of reasons, but one of them, it's just crept up on us that we're very nearly at our 500th episode. So do keep in touch with our social media posts in the coming weeks. We are going to be doing something for our 500th episode, which will be slightly different. I think people will be interested. We might even mix in a bit of a meetup with our 500th episode, which would be great because we've not done one for such a long time. So do look out for more information on that. But the other thing, Andy, we went viral this week. I know we do a lot of social media posts on all the different platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Twitter, Facebook. And we've had quite a bit of success with teaching people about money. But this week, we probably had our biggest success to date when I posted about the state pension deadline, which is actually going to be one of the pieces on the podcast this week. But that particular meme that I created about the deadline that's fast approaching, as we make this podcast, has hit 200,000 views on Instagram, which is an incredible number for a meme, because it's teaching people about pensions, but in a slightly unusual way. So do go and have a look at our Instagram feed so you can see it on there, and do comment, and you'll probably want to bookmark that particular post. But I will be covering some of the details in today's show.
Yeah, and so 200,000 views on Instagram on a subject like pensions is massive, let's be honest, and that's in just a couple of days. And I'll be honest, Damien, we record this podcast ahead of when people can listen to it, so who knows what that number will be when it goes out on Sunday. Anyway, let's get on with what's coming up on this week's show. We've got three pieces as usual.
So inspired by that post on Instagram, I'm going to do a short piece explaining why people need to be checking their state pension forecast and maybe taking action ahead of the 5th of April if they want to boost their pension by possibly thousands of pounds. Now, taking on that theme a bit further, I'm going to be talking about boosting your pension more widely. So looking at defined contribution pensions. So I'm going to give you more than 20 ways to possibly boost your pension. Then the final piece on the show, Andy, you're going to be looking at a little known fact, really. I didn't know this ahead of you discovering it, in relation to credit card applications.
So we had a really interesting question from a listener, and they posed the question that they were looking around on the best deals for an interest-free balance transfer credit card, and the one that topped the list was actually an existing credit card provider that they had already, and they wondered if they would qualify for that new offer. So we have an answer to that. I spoke to a few credit card providers, and from speaking to them, there's a little extra tip I'm going to give people. I'll save that for the end of the show. So let's get on with the first piece of the podcast then, Damien. It links back to that meme that went viral. There's a deadline coming up in regards to the state pension.
So it's essential for everybody to make sure that they maximise their state pension and that you qualify for the full amount, which currently stands at £221.20 per week. Now, the amount increases each year based upon the triple lock pension rules, and you usually need 10 qualifying national insurance years to get some form of the new state pension, but you have to have around 35 full qualifying years to get the full new state pension. Those who started their national insurance contributions prior to 2016 could ultimately need more than 35 years worth of qualifying national insurance contributions, but we'll put a link in the notes to more information on that. But you need to check what your predicted amount of state pension is going to be, because it can be different for different people. Now, you can check your state pension forecast on the government's website. We'll put a link in the notes so you can go across and do that. Now, you'll need your government gateway ID. If you've got one, it's easy to sign up if you haven't, and you'll also need your national insurance number. Now, this will show you what you've already qualified for and the likely amount you are going to get at retirement in terms of your state pension. When you get your state pension forecast, there will be a link that you can click on to go and view your national insurance record. Then you can see if there are any gaps. If there are, you may be able to fill them. There is an important deadline on the 5th of April 2025, because if you pay to fill any gaps on your national insurance record before then, you can fill gaps going back as far as 2006. If you do it after that date, you will only be able to go back and fill gaps as far back as the last 6 years. Now, if you're worried about missing the deadline to pay any voluntary national insurance contributions before the 5th of April 2025 to plug those gaps, there is a callback request form on the DWP website. We'll put a link to it in the notes, which you can go on and register so you can get a callback, and you will potentially be able to pay those voluntary contributions and plug the gaps going back as far as 2006 after the 5th of April 2025. It's worth pointing out that it's not only paid work that earns you national insurance years. There are a number of other scenarios where you may have earned national insurance credits over those years, and these include being unemployed and actively seeking employment. You may have been receiving statutory sick pay or caring for a family member, or you may have been receiving child benefit. Again, I'll put a link in the notes where you can read more about national insurance credits, but it's important to check if any of the scenarios apply to you and whether you've been credited in the past if you've got any gaps. Now, if you have any gaps and you aren't eligible for any credits that were missed, then is it worth topping up your state pension by paying these voluntary national insurance contributions if you're not getting that full £221.20 per week as we make this video? Well, it costs £824 to buy a full national insurance year, and that can potentially add £303 a year to your state pension when you get to claim it. So you'd have to do the maths. Generally speaking, if you are in relatively good health and you're near retirement age, then it does tend to favour you paying for them, but you have to do the maths yourselves. But even if you're younger, fill in those gaps between 2006 and 2016, which you can do prior to the 5th of April 2025, might still be worthwhile. Now, again, there is a link in the notes to a full explainer about this deadline and the various choices that you have. So make sure you go and read that to get the full information and all the links that I've mentioned as well, so you can make a decision. But do make sure you tell people about it, because the deadline is set in stone. They have moved the goalposts a few times, but I don't think they're going to keep moving it. So it's something to bear in mind. Now, I'm going to move straight on to the next piece on the podcast, Andy, which is how to boost your pension more generally. I'm going to tell you more than 20 ways in which you can boost your pension. And when I talk about pension, I'm talking about defined contribution pensions as well as your state pension. In a recent video, I applied a number of the tips that I'm going to talk about to illustrate how anyone without any pension savings, even somebody aged 50, can retire with a pension income of £37,500 a year, which happens to be the national average wage. Now, of course, it goes without saying, if you pay more into your pension, then you'll get a bigger pot at the end and you'll ultimately get a bigger income. Now, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs by saying that, but it's still worth you getting an idea of what sort of pension fund you're going to have at retirement and the associated retirement income as a general starting point when you're watching and listening to this. So I suggest that you use the pension calculator from Money Helper, which is my particular favourite, and there is a link in the notes, and all you have to do is enter your current savings, your contributions, your pension pots, etc., and it will work out how much your pension pot will be when you come to retire and how much income it might generate. So my first tip is make sure you're claiming tax relief on your pension contributions. The good news is that basic rate taxpayers can claim 20% tax relief on contributions into a pension, while higher rate and additional rate taxpayers can claim a total of 40% and 45% respectively. This means that if a basic rate taxpayer pays £80 into a pension, it is topped up by HMRC to £100. But while 20% basic tax relief is usually claimed automatically and added to your pot by your pension provider, higher rate and additional rate taxpayers need to claim that additional tax relief owed to them via self-assessment. Now, each year, higher rate and additional rate taxpayers leave millions of pounds of pension tax relief unclaimed. Between 2016 and 2021, up to £1.3 billion £500 worth of tax relief was unclaimed. Now, for higher rate and additional rate taxpayers, the additional tax relief doesn't actually boost their pension as such, but it reduces their tax bill for that particular tax year, and it may mean that they can afford to contribute more to their pensions, being mindful, of course, of the annual limits and the max tax relief that you can claim, but I will explain that in a bit more detail later on. My next tip is if you're employed, make sure you are automatically enrolled in your workplace pension. If you've previously opted out, consider rejoining if you are eligible. And the criteria I'm going to show up on screen and put links in the notes to. Now, the current auto-enrollment minimum requires a total of 8% of your salary to go into your pension. This is split as 4% from you, 3% from your employer, and 1% from tax relief. So that's free money on the table. However, this 8% is based on qualifying earnings, which may be less than your total earnings, especially if you're a low or high earner. So the next tip is ask your employer if they will match your 5% pension contributions. Many people will. And also ask whether they would consider paying those contributions based on your full earnings rather than your qualifying earnings. So pension contributions are calculated in terms of qualifying earnings between £6,240 and £50,270, and that's for the 2024-2025 tax year. Next, it's worth looking at how your employer pays your pension contributions. Often they will be done via something called a net pay arrangement, where pension contributions are taken from your salary before income tax and national insurance are deducted. This means you automatically receive the full tax relief regardless of your income level, and you don't need to claim additional tax relief if you're an additional or higher rate taxpayer. And this will be clear on your payslip if they are using this method. Alternatively, they may be using a relief at source arrangement where tax is taken before your pension contribution and the pension provider then claims back basic tax relief. It means that the high rate and additional rate taxpayers will need to claim the additional tax relief they're entitled to through self-assessment, as I've mentioned earlier. Probably the easiest way to think of this arrangement, it works in the same way as if you were given your net pay and you then had a personal pension which you contributed to. Next up, it's worth considering salary sacrifice. So with salary sacrifice, you agree to sacrifice part of your salary, which then isn't subject to income tax or national insurance. And this benefits both you and your employer. Now, in the near future, national insurance is going to be going up for employers, so don't be surprised if there are more employers promoting salary sacrifice schemes. If you do set this up with your employer, you could then ask your employer to put the national insurance savings that they have into your pension as well, which will boost your pot even further. However, I must stress this isn't to be considered lightly, as there are some drawbacks. So aside from reducing your take-home pay, some benefits like maternity pay, statutory sick pay are based on your reported salary. Also, bear in mind, if salary sacrifice reduces your salary below certain national insurance thresholds, you might receive less state pension or benefits. It could also lower your death in service life insurance benefits through work because they are often based upon a multiple of your salary. And it could even reduce the size of mortgage that you could get when you go to try and borrow money. So it's one thing to bear in mind. There's a lot to think about. Put a link in the notes to more information on salary sacrifice, but it's not to be considered lightly. Next, look at the underlying investments in your pension. So in my recent video titled Get a Pension Worth £37,500 a year by saving just £104 a month, I explained the problem and the ultimate solution with regard to pension default fund. So many people stay in their pension default fund where you end up by default, but this isn't always the best option for them. So I suggest you check performance of your pension default fund against a benchmark based upon what that fund is invested in. So if it's a 60% equity, 40% bond fund, then I would suggest perhaps looking at the Vanguard Life Strategy 60% equity fund as a good benchmark for performance. So the message is don't languish in underperforming funds. When it comes to asset mix, one good rule of thumb is the age guide. And that works by taking your age away from 100. So if you're 40, that leaves 60, and that is the approximate equity exposure that somebody who had a balanced approach to risk might take in their investments and pensions. Of course, you will adjust that for your attitude to risk, and as you near retirement, you might tweak the amount you have exposed to equities and bonds. You might actually want something that's a little bit safer. But if you are comfortable with taking on more investment risk, then the next tip is perhaps to increase your risk level if you've got a long time till retirement. Say you might not be retiring for 20 years, in pursuit of higher returns, because you have much more time for your portfolio to recover if there is a market correction. Now, the increased risk that you take might be you increasing your exposure to equities, for example, but that does mean that you should still be diversified across a wide range of assets and within them. So by taking a bit more risk, you could potentially increase your pension pot when you come to retire. If you are comfortable with investing, then another tip could be to look at running your own pension yourself and choosing from a wider range of options than you might have within your employer's scheme, particularly if it's an old scheme. Now, some workplace pensions allow partial transfers into self-invested personal pensions, which are SIPs. Now, this can give you more control over your investments, and you also have a wider choice of investments, and it could mean you potentially reduce fees, but you have to check all of that. Now, one other thing I would say you have to check is ensure that you would still remain in this scheme for the definitions of your employer matched pension contributions. So you are still a member and they will still match your pension contributions if you do a partial transfer. But again, it's something that isn't to be considered lightly and you would need to seek advice on, something I'm going to come on to later on when it comes to advice. Now, the next tip is whatever pensions you have, and especially if you have lots of them, you might have many pensions from past employments, you need to review them all. You obviously need to look at how they're invested, but you also need to be mindful of their charges and look to reduce them. So calculations from AJ Bell, which I have verified, show what difference it could make if you just cut your pension charges by 0.25% a year. So in their example, if you had £100,000 in a pension pot and you paid 1% in fees and benefited from 5% investment growth, which isn't outlandish by any stretch of the imagination, then after 1 year, you'd have £104,000 in your pot. If you cut those charges by just a quarter of a percentage point to 0.75%, you'd have £104,250 in your pot at the end of the year instead. Now, that extra £250 might not sound like a lot, but it does multiply over time. Over 20 years, it adds up to more than £10,780 extra you would have in your pot by just cutting the charges by 0.25%. But if your pension charges are near 1.5% rather than the 1% they started off with in their example, which I'd argue many people's are if they are in particularly old pensions, then the size of that potential saving and the boost to your pot will be even greater. Talking of past pensions, according to the Association of British Insurers, the value of lost pensions in the UK has risen by 60% since 2018. It means 3.3 million pension pots are now considered lost at an average sum of £9,470. That's over £31 billion worth of lost pensions. Research from PensionBee suggests that nearly 1 in 10 workers believe they could have lost a pension pot worth more than £10,000. So how do people lose pensions? Well, they generally do it when they change jobs, which people do regularly, and they lose track of who their employer was or who was administering the pension, or they move address and they therefore lose the paperwork and the company can't trace them. So make sure you track down lost pensions. The pension tracing service, which you can find on the gov.uk website, we'll put a link in the notes, is a free service that can help you find old and lost pensions. The service is relatively basic, but its main purpose is to provide you with the relevant contact details of the pension administrator, and it's then down to you to liaise with them directly. The next tip is that you might want to consider whether it's worth consolidating your pensions into a low-cost pension plan with a good choice of investments. Now, there are a wide range of companies out there that can help find and consolidate old pensions into one plan. PensionBee is the market leader, in my opinion, in doing this, but you can see on screen that we have reviewed all the market leaders out there, and there is a table that gives you the benefits and services each offers. Now, you can find links to all the full reviews of each service in the notes of this video as well, so you can go and read them at your own leisure. Now, these services will only transfer defined contribution pensions, but they will make you aware of any pensions that you tell them about if they end up having guaranteed benefits or if they are defined benefit pensions. Now, as a default, you are unlikely to be better off transferring a defined benefit pension anyway, so final salary pensions, you generally are better off keeping them. Which then leads me nicely on to my next point, which is about getting advice. If you are in a final salary scheme, also known as a defined benefit pension, there is now a legal requirement to seek financial advice before transferring to a SIP or a private pension if the funds are worth more than £30,000. The same rule applies if you are in a defined contribution pension worth more than £30,000 and has guaranteed benefits, which an advisor will look at for you. But aside from pondering whether to consolidate your pensions, reviewing your pensions, and particularly when it comes to drawing on your pension for an income, is a bit of a minefield. And it's the one time where I believe people should seek financial advice from a qualified financial advisor. If you don't know a financial advisor who you trust to carry out a full review of your pensions, personal circumstances and make a recommendation, then there are services out there such as Vouched For or Unbiased which can connect you with a financial advisor. Vouched for example, works by providing customer reviews, so it's like the financial services equivalent of TripAdvisor. There is a link in the notes to an article on the Money to Masses website which explains all of this in more detail and includes details of how to get a free pension review with a qualified advisor via Unbiased. Now, initial consultations are generally free with financial advisors, but you will have to pay for full-blown recommendations and for them to be implemented. So how much does the advice cost? Now, Vouched For carried out some research and they found that the initial fees charged by advisors range from 0.5% to 5% of investable assets, with the average being 1.86%. When you're looking at the ongoing charges, they range from 0% to 3.2%. Typically, the average for that is nearer 0.77%. Now, bear in mind, some advisors will instead work on fixed fees basis or a combination of a fixed fee and maybe an ongoing charge. So don't forget that all of these fees are negotiable, so shop around to make sure that you are happy, and don't let cost necessarily put you off, because you may have access to something called the pension advice allowance, which is my next tip, and that lets you withdraw up to £500 tax-free up to 3 times once per tax year from a defined contribution pension to pay for regulated financial advice on retirement planning, investments and tax efficiency. The withdrawal doesn't count as taxable income and you can use it before age 55. The pension provider pays the advisor directly, although not all schemes actually offer this option. Now, don't worry if you don't have access to that particular allowance, then a lot of people don't realise that if you are over 50, you can book a free 60-minute appointment with PensionWise, which is backed by the government, and they offer free impartial guidance on your retirement options. Next up, I've mentioned checking benefits, but I just want to reiterate the point that you should check for things like guaranteed annuity rates on old pensions. And I know they won't boost your pension pot as such, but they will increase the retirement income your DC pension might produce. Now, talking of annuities takes me on to my next point. When you come to retirement, you could choose to buy an annuity to deliver a guaranteed income in retirement. Now, bear in mind, if you have a reduced life expectancy, perhaps due to health conditions or lifestyle factors, you should consider an enhanced life annuity. Now, these can provide a higher guaranteed income and as much as 75% extra income in certain circumstances. Money Helper allows you to see the kind of income you could generate via an enhanced annuity based upon your state of health, with a useful tool which you can use online and put in your details. Again, there'll be a link in the notes to that particular tool. Of course, annuities aren't the only solution. Using drawdown, where your pension pot remains invested and you draw income or lump sums from it, is another option. But as I explained in a recent YouTube video, and I'll put a link to it again in the notes, a combination of phased level annuity purchases and drawdown can generate an even greater income in retirement, potentially based upon research from Standard Life. Now, talking of delaying, while delaying annuity purchase increases the annuity rate you receive from an insurer, it could also allow you to have more time to allow your pension pot to grow and allow you to contribute to it for longer. Also, if you continue to work, bear in mind, if you work beyond state pension age, you will no longer have to pay national insurance contributions, which you could potentially put into your pension, assuming that you have an allowance left to be able to do that. If you don't know your state pension age, I know most people probably don't, or they assume it's younger than it actually is, you can check it on the gov.uk website. Before I move on to the state pension, I just want to cover paying more into your pension and the limits. Don't forget, you can only contribute up to 100% of your earnings or £60,000, whichever is lower, and get tax relief. This total limit applies to your personal and employer contributions combined. If your earnings are lower than £60,000, you can only contribute up to your total earnings. If your adjusted income is above £260,000, your annual allowance is reduced. So for every £2 above this, your annual allowance reduces by £1 down to a minimum of £10,000. Also, if you've accessed your pension already, then the money purchase annual allowance kicks in, which is £10,000 a year. But a tip for those who are high earners who want to contribute more into their pension than they normally would be allowed to in a tax year and have paid sufficient tax to claim the additional relief, they could carry forward unused pension allowances. Under the rules, you can carry forward up to 3 years of unused pension annual allowances, which can be useful if you've had a large bonus or windfall. There's a link to more info in the notes which explains how it works, but one thing to remember is that you can only use this if you were a member of a registered pension scheme in each of the 3 years. You also can't use carry forward for money purchase DC arrangements if you triggered the money purchase annual allowance. But one tip, if you're thinking about potentially using the carry forward rules in the future, maybe you don't have a pension right now and you expect a massive increase in earnings, then it's worth opening a personal pension and putting some money into it, even if it's only £100, to allow you to use the carry forward rules in the future and therefore ultimately boost your pension pot. It's also worth pointing out that if you have a spouse that perhaps doesn't work, they can also receive tax relief on pension contributions of up to £2,880 per year, which when you add in the tax relief takes the gross contribution to £3,600 in a given tax year. So if you view your finances holistically, it's a way to boost the family pension if you put a contribution into their pension. Finally, I talked about delaying retirement earlier on. You can also defer claiming your state pension in order to get a higher amount when you do eventually claim it. If you've reached state pension age after the 6th of April 2016, you could get a 1% boost for every 9 weeks you defer. If you reach state pension before the 6th of April 2016, you can choose to receive a lump sum or higher weekly payments. This can make a meaningful difference if you expect a long retirement, as the higher payments could help offset inflation and rising living costs. Additionally, if you have other sources of income, delaying your state pension can also be a tax efficient strategy, helping you avoid higher taxes being paid while you're still working. However, there are some drawbacks to consider. It takes time to break even, depending on how long you delay. It can even take years of higher payments before you make up for the pension you've missed. If you have health conditions or a shorter life expectancy, you might end up receiving less overall. Additionally, while deferring might work well for some, it could affect means-tested benefits like pension credit, as the extra income later on could reduce what you're entitled to. Plus, unlike a private pension, the state pension doesn't pass to your heirs, so delaying it won't create any kind of inheritance benefit for your family. So weighing up these pros and cons is important and crucial before you make a decision. I mentioned pension credit there, but a tip is that when you get to state pension age, do make sure that you check your eligibility for pension credit. It's a means-tested benefit if you're over state pension age and on a low income. So there you go, Andy, a roundup of all the ways you can boost your pension. I feel exhausted, to be honest, after going through all of that.
Okay, so for the final piece of the podcast, we're going to talk very briefly about credit cards, because we were posed a question this week that we didn't know the answer to. And when we found out the answer, we thought, well, that's interesting, definitely worth bringing to the podcast. And so a listener got in touch because they were interested in moving over the balance of a credit card where the interest-free period was due to end, move it over to a different credit card to take advantage of a new 0% balance transfer offer. Now, having looked around, they found a deal that they liked, but the credit card provider that was top of the list was actually the same provider that they already had an existing card with. And it posed the question to them, would they get accepted? Of course, they didn't want to apply for that credit card, only for that provider to say, hang on, you're an existing customer, you don't actually qualify for this. And ultimately, they'd have a hard credit check done on their file and they'd get rejected. And ultimately, that could impact them applying for other credit cards going forward. So I spoke to a few credit card providers and asked them that question. And the answer I got back was quite interesting. Ultimately, if the credit card that comes up on the eligibility checkers are different in name to the credit card that the customer has, then there is a likelihood that they would be accepted on that new credit card. Now, all the usual caveats apply. It depends on individual circumstances. It also depends on income and debt and things like that. But assuming that you pass all of those criteria, the fact that it's an existing credit card provider that you're applying through shouldn't impact the application process. So to use an example, if you're a Santander customer, let's say, and you have an all-in-one credit card and you saw an offer for a new credit card, let's say their everyday long-term balance transfer credit card, you'll be assessed on that being a new product. Of course, you're an existing customer, so they would look at your existing credit cards as well when factoring the risk, and individual circumstances will apply in that scenario, but you wouldn't automatically be rejected just because you're an existing customer. But that leads me on to the next point, which I found really interesting. Because you already have an existing credit card with them, they might not necessarily give you the amount of credit that you originally applied for. So you could be in a situation where you've done the eligibility check-in, you love the offer, you apply for them, and then you're disappointed because they've said, yeah, you will get the 32 months, but instead of £5,000, we're only actually going to give you a £2,000 credit limit on there. That will obviously be really disappointing because you've now had that hard credit check and now you haven't got what you asked for. But, and this is quite interesting, some credit card providers will allow you to use some of your available credit balance on an existing card and shift it over to the new one. So in our same example there, the all-in-one credit card, let's assume you had a £5,000 credit limit on there that you weren't using. Your new credit card comes through with a £2,000 balance. You could shift some of that over to the new card and take advantage of that extended 0% balance transfer deal. So let's say that £5,000 shifted over and added to the £2,000, you'd then get a £7,000 limit on the new card with the new deal. Obviously, individual circumstances again apply. It doesn't work for all credit card providers, but it's something worth considering. Do speak to the credit card provider because they'll be able to tell you whether it's something they can do for you. Damien, I thought that was really interesting. I thought it was good for the pod. We learn something new every day.
I think that was a great piece, and it's great to get questions from listeners because they do inspire things that we don't necessarily know. And like Andy found out, I didn't even know the answer to that particular question. So we all learn something by asking questions. So do send them in, usual place, Damien@moneytothemasses.com or Andy@moneytothemasses.com. So that's it for this week. Do please leave a review for the podcast, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify, or whatever app that you use. Do also follow us on all our social channels and do share and like the things that you see because it does help us grow our channels and go viral. Do join our Facebook group, go join us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, all of those things, and also sign up to our weekly newsletter at Money to Masses. You'll get a newsletter every Sunday at 10 a.m. of all the stories that matter and impact your finances. You can do that at moneytothemasses.com/weekly-newsletter. So Andy, all that's left is for us to say until next time.
Until next time.